Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. And this episode takes us to the City of Light, Paris, which hosted this year's, that is 2023, JupyterCon, the conference for all things around the Jupyter platform. Over 3 days between the 10th and the 12th of May 2023, developers, entrepreneurs, volunteers, researchers, and students met at the Cité de la Science in the northeastern district of Paris. This has been the first face-to-face Jupyter conference since the pandemic, the first time it was held in Paris, and the first JupyterCon for me personally. So there was quite a bit to be excited about, and in this episode I want to give you impressions from the conference and let you hear from some of the people I met, including members from the Jupyter Executive Council. JupyterCon was organized by a strong team led by Sylvain Collet from QuantStack, Gail Ollington, who is Jupyter's Community Events Manager, and Nell Varrocourt, who is a researcher at the French National Research Centre CNRS. Not to mention, of course, many of the volunteers who dedicated their time and energy to help run this event smoothly, and you'll hear from one of them, Raniere, a little bit later. Jupyter itself is a non-profit and open-source project. It's known for the popular Jupyter notebooks and Jupyter Lab apps, which are used by millions of people worldwide. Jupyter's success is built on a strong community of contributors, be that individuals and volunteers or organizations and companies. It also, of course, relies on strong help from sponsors and partners. Partners like, for instance, Numfocus. So I'd like you to meet the Executive Director Leah Silen and the Developer Advocate Arliss from Numfocus, who I talked to during one of the conference breaks. Hello, and here I am with Arliss and Leah from Numfocus. And Numfocus is, of course, an organization that we will find out in just about a minute. So can I hand over to you, Leah, and to explain a little bit about what Numfocus is for the listeners who may not be familiar with it?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Peter. As Peter said, we are with Numfocus. So my name is Leah Silen, and I'm the executive director. And sitting next to me is Arliss Collins, our developer advocate. And we are sitting here with a table full of stickers that are showing all of the Numfocus projects that we sponsor that are under our umbrella, our legal umbrella, and that we provide project services for. So Numfocus is here. Our mission is to support open source scientific computing projects. And we have just little under 60 projects under our umbrella that we provide services for, both to the internal contributor community as well as to the user community through educational initiatives, through events such as Jupyter Con. We also have many other project events that we help out with, as well as the PyData event series. And Arliss works very closely with our projects and makes sure that we're on track with those services. Arliss, you want to say a few words?
Absolutely. So as the developer advocate at Numfocus, as Leah said, we have 60 projects. So my day-to-day job is to check in with each of these projects, see how things are going, what are they working on, what are they passionate about at that time, and then figuring out how Numfocus can provide services that will help them achieve the goals that they're looking for.
The conference itself was organized in different parallel tracks, as is usual. These ranged from education, community tools and practices, to data science and enterprise infrastructure. Tutorial and practical sessions were also available, and if that wasn't enough, the conference was followed by 2 days of hands-on workshops. Right after Sylvain Collet kicked off the conference on the 10th of May, there were a range of interesting talks, one of which touched on the subject of scientific publishing. This is a subject close to my heart. Franklin Koch from Curvenote presented a tool called MyST, which stands for Markedly Structured Text. That is, how to use Markdown and its extensions in Jupyter notebooks to produce interactive and compelling scientific papers for communication. And luckily, I had a chance to have a chat with Franklin about this after his talk. Hello, Franklin. Nice to meet you. You gave a very interesting talk about MyST. Perhaps you can quickly introduce yourself.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Franklin Koch. I work for a company called Curvenote, and we also do a lot of work with executable books, which is what MyST is part of.
That's exactly what I want to talk about, because we're talking about workflow and scientific papers. How do you see MyST fitting into that?
MyST is the big picture is that it's trying to improve scientific publication and enable authors who have interesting computations in their work, enable them to publish their science in a way that respects that interactivity. So MyST is a few different things. I guess it's sort of a markdown format that you can use to write your paper that is an extension of Common Mark, which is a basic markdown format. And it takes inspiration from restructured text and adds a few features just to make it nice for people who already work in Jupyter notebooks. So yeah, there's that format to author in, and then MyST also has tools to take that content and build websites that maintain the interactivity from the Jupyter notebooks.
That's good, because I saw a presentation earlier today, and that was really great to see the kind of interactivity which goes beyond the standard PDF. And yet, journals still love PDFs. How do you get from your MyST publication and website to a journal?
Yeah, so I think that this starting a movement kind of thing, to changing how the publishing industry works is not going to happen overnight, as I think probably anyone would say. But where Curvenote is starting is we've found a few publishers who are willing to kind of take the plunge and do things differently. And most of these right now are in preprint stage. So we're thinking about how peer reviews work and how we get further in the formalization of the process. But right now, there are a few journals who are just like, oh yeah, we'd rather have a nice website where you can click around and run code rather than just look at static PDFs.
Could you name the journals?
Yeah, I guess Physiome is the first one that we released and is marketing. And then we're working with Notebooks Now, which is an AGU journal. They already see notebooks as first-class medium for scientists writing in and want to make those notebooks be publishable as actual publications. And so we're working with them kind of to figure out what that looks like and where we need to formalize things to align with the publishing industry versus where we can kind of flex our muscles a little bit and do more interesting things.
The need for a change in scientific communication was a subject that came up several times during this conference. And not least in the keynote from Alyssa Goodman from Harvard University on the second day of the conference. In her talk, she demonstrated a tool called Glue and Jupyter to help visualize astrophysical phenomena in 3D, which was all very fascinating. But back to the subject of scientific communication, because everybody recognizes that changing the world of scientific communication will take time. But it is encouraging to see, as Franklin said, that some publishers have come on board. And maybe we will be able to say goodbye to the PDF at some stage in the future. Education is another area where Jupyter shines. As I mentioned, an entire track was dedicated to this conference. An increasing number of schools and universities are using Jupyter notebooks, for instance, so much so that the question becomes how to provide an infrastructure which can help providing Jupyter in the classroom more effectively. Listeners of this podcast may remember my conversation on the subject with Nicolas Thiery from Paris-Saclay and his project proposal Candice. Being a distinguished contributor to Jupyter, it was no surprise to see Nicolas at this conference, and I was lucky to grab a few minutes of his time for a chat. And just before we met, we heard from the project Capital, which is also working to improve infrastructure with Jupyter in schools. So here now my conversation with Nicolas. Hello, and with me here today is Nicolas Thiery, and listeners may remember Nicolas from our interview about Jupyter in the classroom, so I guess this is one of the reasons why you're here today.
Hey Peter, it's good to see you again.
We also heard a talk about Capital yesterday from another one who is working in Jupyter in the classroom, and I wonder if there's any relation between that and Candice.
Yes, definitely. Actually, Capital is one of the many projects that inspired Candice in the first place. So essentially what happened the last years is in many different contexts. So for Capital, it's for high school teaching, also for many universities. We have had the need for infrastructure, Jupyter infrastructure, And many people in each little institution built this kind of infrastructure. Capital is what they did to support the needs for high school. And the goal of Candice is inspired by all those little needs to try to see, could we get together and have, instead of each spending energy on our side, to build one piece of infrastructure or try to do things as common as possible to solve all common needs.
And when I looked at the slides yesterday, there were an enormous amount of people actually registered users on Capital. I think he was mentioning 280,000 or more. And so you would think there is actually a pressing need for some common infrastructure. So what is the difficulty in convincing the authorities to give funding?
Well, the main difficulty is that, yes, there are pressing needs right now, but currently the state is also having to face other big pressing needs, like shall we buy munition for Ukraine? Shall we invest into hydrogen energy and things like this? So this is really, at this stage, really this kind of political decisions that needs to be taken. And I must say, I'm glad not to have to take this kind of decision.
Yeah, I'm glad too. So I'm glad not to be a politician. Jupyter in the classroom, I think, at least in France, this seems to be adopted very well. Are you working with other European partners or other partners in the world on this?
Definitely, the goal of Candice is to make contacts with other places that will have similar projects, and in the long run to not have one thing for France, but one thing for everywhere. There is this big question, is whether we should have one infrastructure that fits everybody, or should we take the path of making it easy to deploy such infrastructure so that if a country needs one or if an institution needs one, it's easy for them to deploy. So we're kind of exploring this dual way of deploying something at scale and making it easy for others to deploy. And if others have similar needs and if there is opportunity to join forces, yes, definitely we should do it. And actually, this is already what we are naturally doing it in the Jupyter ecosystem, because everything is done in a quite modular way, and we're focusing on building bricks so that we can easily collaborate on these bricks. And then maybe the platforms will be different, but as long as 99% of the bricks are common, it's not so much work to have our own bespoke infrastructure for our specific needs.
Let's move from the education track to the community tools and practices track, where I met with Sarah Gibson, actually for the first time face-to-face. Sarah gave a number of presentations at the conference, but I want to highlight one of them, which was on the subject of Outreachy. Outreachy is an organization that provides internships to people from underrepresented groups and who experience systemic bias, which is a noble undertaking, but how do you actually organize this in practice, and what lessons can be learned? And this was the subject of my conversation with Sarah. Unfortunately, the only reasonably quiet place we could find was close to an air conditioning duct, so there will be a little bit of humming background noise in the recording. Hello, Sarah again. Sarah, you're a regular visitor and guest on this podcast, and I'm very grateful for that.
Hello, it's wonderful to be talking to you again, and this time in person. How amazing!
It is, and there is a photo as a proof.
Yeah, there is.
Anyway, I want to talk to you because you've been given 2 talks yesterday.
Yeah, 2 talks yesterday. So it's been a busy old conference for me.
Indeed, because I thought it was great, the Outreachy program. Maybe you can quickly explain a little bit to the listeners what that is, and then we can go into the questions.
Yeah, so Outreachy is a great non-profit organization that puts interns into open source and open science programs and projects in order to learn about how to do open science and open source and work on some really cool code bases. And they primarily offer these internships to people who are from underrepresented groups, particularly in the tech system. These internships are paid, they're fully remote, and they last for 3 months and they happen twice a year.
I mean, there are lots of stuff to celebrate because you got an internship which is paid and for 3 months. But there were some challenges, and I think that's something that I would like to talk to you about. I think one of which was onboarding, and maybe you can explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I said in my talk, like, one way to figure out how good your onboarding documentation is to have, 60 plus interns turn up at the same time and try to, do stuff. So it was a challenge to manage the influx of questions. How do I do this? What do I do next? What's the next thing? I don't understand that. and sort of making sure that that was a single communication channel that was clear for the interns and for everybody who was trying to help as well. We learned a lot about our onboarding materials and we were able to improve those as a result. Like, definitely a stress test, emphasis on the stress, but we got some really good results out of it.
Indeed. And I think one of the questions that I have in particular is the first issues. So you have a newcomer, showing up on Monday bright and early at 9 o'clock in the morning. And what do you give them to do? How much work does need to go into it to make that work?
It's a lot. So the new first issues I was specifically talking about were for the contribution period, which is like instead of an interview. So they've not like agreed to take the project with us yet. And similarly, we've not agreed to hire them. It's a really fine balance between giving an issue that is small enough and well scoped enough and achievable enough that someone who may have never worked on GitHub before can like start working. But you also don't want to make it so easy that everybody piles onto it and everybody's doing it and they do it multiple times and everything. And I feel like writing a good first issue in any context is really hard because like you have to think about exactly what the problem is, what the scope of it is, what pieces will need to be touched and able to actually provide a fix, and like what does an appropriate fix look like so that someone who has no context can get that context and start running with it, compared to as you get experienced in the project, you probably know some of the things of like, they want to do this and I know that doing that kind of thing involves this piece over there and like there's a post request there or something, so I know that we can be able to do this. That kind of context of the project only comes over time. It's also a thing that's really difficult when you have the context. It's really difficult to be aware of that and acknowledge it and like actually write it down in a way that another human being without context doesn't understand. So it's a lot of effort, and then you have to do that a lot of times. And you also have to design specifically with these first issues for Outreachy. You want the result that the intern, the applicant gives you to like tell you something about their ability to complete the larger project that they'll be paid to do as well. Yeah, it's a multi-dimensional optimizing, scoping problem, and it takes a lot of effort.
Well, we talked about the education and the community track, but what about Jupyter itself? We mustn't forget that core Jupyter services and applications themselves are constantly being updated. And so the Jupyter team presented new versions of JupyterLab, version 4, as well as a new version of the popular Jupyter Notebook, version 7, which, at the time of recording, is in beta. The latest version of JupyterLab has a new text editor, a new extension manager, and improved document search. Likewise, version 7 of Jupyter Notebooks will see a number of features introduced that come from development of JupyterLab. There are links in the notes, and I encourage you to check them out. Give the new versions a try. Technical innovations are not the only things, though, that are changing at Jupyter. As the number of users and contributors grow, the organization needs to make sure it can do justice to all the different needs and innovations that are happening within the community. And so, on the second day, the Executive Council of Jupyter presented a new governance model, which was brought to life in December 2022. One of the members of the Executive Council is Anna Ruvalcaba, and I was able to talk to her about these changes briefly. Thank you very much for taking the time, and we're going to talk about community, but perhaps you can start talking a bit about your background and what it is you're doing at Jupyter.
Yes. So I am the only non-software engineer on the Project Jupyter Executive Council. I can share a little bit about my background. For the past 7 years, I've been grant funded to work on things like events, operations, human resources, marketing, all of these non-code contributions that I, in particular, am interested in and able to make.
Jupyter is quite interesting. So you have roles that are actually paid and you have lots of volunteers. So how do you keep all of this together?
That is one of the challenges that we are actively trying to solve right now. I don't think we have the answer, but we definitely have the next step and the next phase in our project trying to solve for this. There are a lot of competing interests at times when it comes to something like this. There is industry involvement, there is academic involvement, and there is volunteer involvement. Lots of different types of amount of time that people can give. And right now, the best model that we can come up with is what we're essentially testing right now, right? So there's an executive council that manages all of Jupyter's interest across the 11 different sub-projects. There is a software steering council, which is made up of one representative from each of the sub-projects. The Software Steering Council is tasked with making important technical decisions for the project. Previously, our steering council was responsible for both things. So we've separated out two different leadership bodies. We also have a group of committees that will report to the Executive Council, who are also tasked with a number of activities like the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. There is the Community Building Committee. We are just in the early stages of a Media Relations Committee. We are needing to form a Code of Conduct Committee to respond to any complaints or investigations that may need to be done. So essentially, we've taken a lot of different responsibilities that were concentrated in one single steering council and spread them out among various committees and named them, as opposed to just having them be floating or unclear.
You have a large number of volunteers contributing to the whole thing. In companies or in organizations, it's relatively easy. There is sort of kind of an instruction, this is what our policies are, and then people are following that because they're contractually obliged, in theory. With volunteers, with an army of volunteers, it's a little bit harder, isn't it? So how do you tackle that problem?
I think we do it through establishing a common interest or a common goal. For example, I lead the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, but none of those people report to me, right? So we meet on a weekly basis. We decide what is important to the group, and we volunteer to take on different parts of what needs to be done. Essentially, what it comes down to is trying to find consensus. And then we do have a decision-making guide that helps us figure out what to do when there isn't consensus. So it's a combination of defining who has the power to make the decision and then tasking that group of people with finding a way to move forward. But yes, you're right. It is challenging because there is no manager who is telling all the people what to do. Somebody might have 5 hours to give this week and next week 0. It's not a consistent path forward, but somehow we keep moving down the path and moving forward.
Another member of the Executive Council is Fernando Perez, who's also the co-founder of Project Jupyter and the 2I2C initiative. In a talk on the second day of the conference, Fernando reflected on 2 decades of Jupyter and presented his thoughts on future strategy and the Jupyter community. He mentioned one of the classics in business literature, The Innovator's Dilemma by Christiansen. This book describes the tension between staying innovative and growing an organization and a business. In the following conversation, Fernando explains why he mentioned Christiansen a little bit further.
In my talk, I kind of left the final slide with a cover of the Innovator's Dilemma book. I do think it's something that the Jupyter community needs to think about a little bit, because we are a project that, even though we've grown with relatively limited resources and small teams compared to, say, the sizes of teams that industry can unleash on projects, right? A lot of this was built by a handful of people at the beginning, and now there's a larger distributed community, but the people who can really spend a lot of their time officially working on the core of Jupyter is limited. And yet we support, in a sense, indirectly through the kind of multiplicative power of the internet and open source, a user base of probably many, many millions of people who use Jupyter across the world. We know from data that has been released, for example, by GitHub at this conference, that there are millions of notebooks on GitHub being used. We know basically all the major tech companies in the world have products that are based on Jupyter. I teach students at Berkeley, courses with thousands of students. Our university has hubs that teach tens of thousands of students on campus, and that's true across other institutions in the US and abroad. How do we maintain that level of a user base that needs things to evolve in a very predictable way, that may not have the resources to be upgrading to the latest and greatest, is not spending their time tracking what's happening on GitHub, while simultaneously being innovative, because we want to innovate, we want to create new things. Well, the world where IPython started 20 years ago, and then the world where Jupyter kind of became what it is today, say 10 years ago, is not the world we are in today regarding questions like open science and the role of AI and the role of the cloud and the role of these tools in everyday education, industry, and research. How do we maintain that balance, right, between stability and innovation is very much the innovator's dilemma that the book described. And I think us as a community should be mindful of that. It's a problem that doesn't have easy answers. Big organizations have cracked their teeth on this. I'm not claiming to have answers, but at least I wanted to flag for our audience that neither end of the spectrum of let's focus only on the shiny, nor let's just make sure that everything keeps working the way it is going to be a satisfactory answer. But maintaining that dynamic equilibrium between those two endpoints is not an easy task. And at least I wanted to kind of bring it up and surface it for our community to reflect on it.
We've seen a number of talks now actually at the conference mentioning we need to replace the PDF. We need to replace this. How do you deal with all these kind of pressures?
Well, we are working on actually contributing to replacing the PDF in some fairly specific ways. A number of people who are at this conference, myself included, for example, are involved with an initiative called Notebooks Now from the American Geophysical Union. So for reference, the American Geophysical Union is one of the largest scientific societies in the world. It hosts an annual conference in December every year in the United States that brings in tens of thousands of scientists. They publish virtually the vast majority of the US-based large scientific journals across Earth, planetary, and space sciences that is not astronomy, but it does include a lot of NASA work that has to do with planetary sciences and remote sensing of Earth, and then everything in Earth from chemistry to biology to environmental issues. And so that is a humongous scientific context. It's also a scientific context that is highly relevant because that's where all kind of climate science happens at AGU. Their publisher is Wiley. So AGU is a scientific society. Their journals are physically published by Wiley, which is one of the largest scientific publishers in the world, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who were the ones who originally funded the first grant to create what was at the time known, or to really grow the IPython notebook. We had a prototype, but then they funded really what allowed the IPython notebook project to grow back in 2012. That same program at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation is now funding AGU, together with their publisher and together with the open source community, to build a prototype of what would it look like to put notebooks in the actual publishing pipeline. Right. Not as a little add-on, not as turn a notebook into a PDF and put it in your supplementary materials, not as in, well, leave a link somewhere in your paper to a binder and hope that people will click on it. No. How do we make notebooks a first-class citizen of the formal, peer-reviewed publishing pipeline of a major scientific piece of the scientific landscape? We're working on that. It's a public project. There's information about it at AGU Notebooks Now. And the idea is to produce a working prototype later this year. The people at this conference, there have been meetings about the low-level graded details of the PDF and XML formats and all that. We're working on it because we do actually want to try to innovate. I mean, I was bringing up the innovator's dilemma as a challenge for us because we do have this tension between creativity and a large user base in some ways. But we are very much trying to create new things and push in these spaces. The work on MyST, for example, is precisely thinking about publishing in the future, communicating computational narratives in the future for everyone, not just for computer scientists or physicists or mathematicians, but for everyone. How do we build things that are friendly and interactive that you can teach someone with no computing experience with, but that you can use to share the most advanced research in the world? And I've seen a lot of work at this conference from the community in that regard.
Towards the end of this report, of this conference, I'd like you to meet Raniere. Like Sarah, I met Raniere only online so far. He works for a research center in Germany called Gesis. It was great to meet him finally in person, and I was really impressed in which Raniere rolled up his sleeves and stepped in to help out as a volunteer. So, for instance, by chairing a few sessions. Volunteers like him are the backbone to community events like this, and I hope he will inspire some of you to volunteer for future events. Hello, Raniere. It's great to see you here at JupyterCon. How has the conference gone for you so far?
It had been a pleasure to meet you again, Peter. The conference had been great. It's a lovely opportunity to meet old friends and make new friends. There is a couple of things that I was really impressed with. One of them is the number of talks about accessibility, which unfortunately is a common issue that we saw in lots of open source projects, which it gets potentialized by this vicious cycle where people that blind or have other accessibility issues, they end up not contributing because in the first place they not are users because the software is not accessible. So there's very interesting talks, different projects that trying to change that, and really looking forward to the next conference to see progress on this area, but also on all other different projects that people had been showing cases.
Yeah, I agree. It was absolutely impressive, this conference, and very energizing. And you've been volunteering to chair some sessions, I saw.
Oh yeah, like as a community conference, there is lots of volunteering tasks that is needed. One of the organizers just emailed me before, one day before the conference saying, hey, we still have some chair slots available. Can you volunteer? So I just step in, and I recommend everyone to be able to volunteer as well. It's a great opportunity to meet some of the speakers and meet some of the other attendees. Highly recommended anyone to step in and be more active part of the conference.
So, if you'd like to help out with future Jupyter Cons, or other conferences for that matter, don't be shy, raise your hand and help out. So this has been really an eventful 3 days, energizing and exhausting for me at the same time. I'm sure others feel the same. There were really excellent talks at this conference, and you will see them on the JupyterCon YouTube channel, which I will share in the episode notes. Apart from the talks, conferences are also a place to meet friends and meet new people, and this conference offered this in spades. And I can't thank the organizers, the many volunteers, and anyone who made this happen enough. Too often we take these events for granted, but they are a gift really, and can only happen with the hard work of dedicated people. And so I look forward to another great JupyterCon, hopefully next year. And while we're on the subject of conferences, allow me to shout out a number of events coming in autumn 2023, starting with the UK RSE conference in Swansea between the 5th and the 8th of September. On the 21st of September, we can look forward to a one-day event on Hidden Ref in the city of Bristol in the UK. Germany will hold its conference in Jena between the 26th and the 28th of September. And the US will hold its first RSE conference ever in the city of Chicago between the 16th and the 18th of October. And this will be a very hot conference autumn indeed. As per usual, you'll find the links to these events in the episode notes. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.